And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. It's an honor today to have a return guest, Ben Schettler, who we consider, in a sense, I'm not sure if he's comfortable with this, but our kind of resident cultural apologist. So Ben, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm honored by that title. I didn't know I got that. That's awesome. I'm doing well and honored to be with you, Josh.
Yes, and we may actually send you a certificate suitable for framing along those lines. And I don't know, you can maybe hold something down with it, I suppose. But no, we're grateful for the Center for Truth and Love. And it's been just remarkable over the last couple of years to see how God has expanded your influence and your ministry. And I know that one of the key issues you've been working on recently is how to engage, how to reach Gen Z. As we're coming to the end, this will be the kind of capstone episode of our kind of month-long deep dive into, as parents, as grandparents, church leaders, Christian school teachers. How do we engage these digital natives with the good news of the gospel and then equip them to go do the same? And so wanted to jump into that, but we'll just start getting a brief update perhaps about your ministry, perhaps for those that haven't met you before. We have a lot of new listeners. So maybe describe a little bit about your ministry and then what's new and exciting.
Yeah, so I run an organization called the Center for Truth in Love. And the Center for Truth and Love exists because of a problem inside of Christianity. And you can divide most Christians, sadly, into one of two groups. On one hand is you have the Christians that want to be loving, but they take culture's definition of love, not the Bible's definition of love, and they don't speak to important or maybe controversial issues. They'll just be silent. Then on the other hand is you have the Christians that do speak, and when they speak, you wish they would be silent because they're so unkind in the way that they speak. Well, God hasn't called us to silence, but he hasn't called us to unkindness. He has called us to speak what is true in a compassionate way. And it's one of the reasons why I love the Good Citizen podcast and what God's leading you to do and your team to do, Josh, because the Good Citizen is all about living the truth in love, I think, in many ways. Yeah. What is true, and because that's true, we're going to live that out in our culture. And so we need to live it out, and we need to declare it. We need to speak it. And how do we do that lovingly? So our mission is to equip believers to speak truth in love. And man, over the last year, we've been catching up. I can't believe the Lord's allowed us to create digital resources for churches. So like if you were in a small group or a family, and so we have some of those available on our website. We have a cool, one thing that listeners may be most interested in is this really cool series we do called The Curious Conversation. We call it the PragerU of Apologetics. It was basically about a 90-second clip that you could share with a friend or even learn from yourself. And that's all on our website at the Center for Truth and Love. But I'm really excited about what God has allowed us to do. And one of the things you mentioned, Josh, you said in recent days, I've been looking at Gen Z. I've actually in recent days been looking at alphas, which is the post-Gen Z. But I've been studying Gen Z for over a decade now. And hopefully I've learned a little bit in that time of study. And so I'm honored to be able to share that a little, with that. And I love that you're tackling, some of these issues of Gen Z.
So a couple of points of follow up there. I love how you frame that. We're trying to live the truth in love. How do you do that well? And then we'll certainly link to the website and some of the resources. What you said, it brought to mind a conversation that we had with a pastor at some point, I think the last year. And the idea was, comes up and the idea was basically, how are we going to reach the next generation? And he says, well, we really need to think hard about how to reach millennials. This is true, but if you're talking about high school students, that's kind of flown the nest. And so, yeah, the next one after Gen Z is going to be Alpha. I suppose we'll have to talk about that soon. But I would be interested, what, in a sense, turned you on to reaching Gen Z? It may have just been, if you're speaking at Christian camps and Christian schools, that's your audience. But was there any specific way that God led you to that topic?
Well, it's actually an interesting story. So the Center for Truth and Love originally was funded by a business that the Lord led my wife and I to start. And that business put us on college campuses. We bought and sold textbooks. So we were on college campuses, and at the same time, I'm speaking to teenagers and talking, and I read a book by a guy named Tim Elmore called IY Generation, in which he really clearly highlights some of the problems of millennials. And this was back in 2009, actually, I read this. And he had a system by which to identify, he's like, here's all the problems. And so what I was able to do is kind of go and look, well, where did all those problems come from? And I really traced it back. I don't want to get too, I'm sorry, I could nerd out really fast.
No, I'm interested.
But what I did was identified a lot of the journal articles coming out in the 1970s in higher education were shaping a lot of the thinking of the millennials in the 80s and 90s. And I was able to trace all of that back. And I came to this, I'm like, okay, so I saw where this was coming from. So I was like, well, if you are able to look at journal articles written in the late 90s and early 2000s, you could make predictions about where Gen Z would be. So at this time, this is 11 years ago, there was no one studying Gen Z in sociological circles. And so I did some research, and I found one researcher at the University or Texas State in San Marcos. And I called her up and I said, who else is studying Gen Z at the time? And she goes, well, I guess it's just you and me. She goes, I don't know anybody.
Welcome to the team.
And so at the time they were called Homelanders, which is a name that didn't stick for obvious reasons. Just, Gen Z is a lot more catchy. And so I actually at that time made some predictions, and it came from all of the research. I was talking with sociologists at the time. I was on college campuses every single day. And so it was really cool because at the time, and this may be helpful to some who do bivocational ministry. Like at the time I was thinking, well, man, I wish I could be full-time at the Center for Truth and Love. And really God was going like, no, I want you on college campuses, talking to professors to shape the future ministry that you're going to have. And so I used the same model for predictions for alphas. If you're interested in that as well, that's what I'm working on now, is going, how can we be prepared to help alphas out? And so that's where all of it came from, was just having conversations with sociologists and using a very specific model that I don't want to bore people with, but to make predictions. And sadly, the prediction that I made in 2010, and this was before Oberfeld, this was before any of these significant decisions in our nation, as I said, the greatest challenge that Gen Z will have is confusion about their human identity. And I think there'd be a lot of people that would agree with that now, but back then people thought I was crazy. They're like, gender confusion is such a fringe issue. There's no way that could be true. And it seems like if you wouldn't say it's the greatest challenge, I think there'd be a lot of people that would say it's certainly significant. And anyway, so I'm sorry if I rambled a little bit there, but that's a little bit of the history of my research.
Well, it is remarkable that I think many Christians just planned on what's in the ivory tower will stay there, but it certainly has translated out into culture. And it's interesting you were looking at those issues back then. And then also I've kind of given up at times trying to, predict or lead a ministry. I mean, you're trying to be strategic, but then God has kind of this other plan going on that looking back, you can kind of see the tapestry and how it all weaves together. But in the moment, you're just like, okay, I'm going to try to be faithful. So it's remarkable. That's how God could have led you into this. So I've got to
add to that because it's so good. But before a conversation, you're like, what are you most excited about? And I cannot about your ministry. And I'm like, I'm excited because I feel like in the next month or so, I'm going to take some time. And I think God is going to reveal to us what's next. Because I feel like that's how we're doing ministry, especially if you're in culture. I'm like, I think God's going to show. I don't know exactly yet. Like, not that we don't have visions and plans, but I'm just like, I think God's going to show. And I think that is where Christians have to be spirit-led in a way where when you're talking about the future, we don't know. We have to follow the Lord and the word. So,
and that's a real encouragement as we're kind of coming to the end of 2021, looking towards the new year. Just we make plans, and then hopefully we're all learning that through the pandemic and other things. That just, where are you leading us next? Be ready to jump on. So we've talked a little bit about generational distinctives, how they learn, a little bit about worldview formation, how to equip Gen Z to get outside the walls of the church. What I'd love to have you talk about is kind of this evangelism piece. What are some of the key apologetics questions? And kind of just wrap up, how can we engage Gen Z? So I think you framed it as a couple of deficits that Gen Z faces, and that's not disparaging to them, but say, hey, this is something that we need to know, we need to think about. And so would you jump into those 5 pieces?
Yeah, the devil is far more interested in getting you to be deceived about what is good than causing you to do what you think is evil. Let me say that again. So I think we have this view that the devil is running around with the pitchfork and trying to get everybody to do what they think is wrong. No. He is far more interested in getting you to think what is wrong is good, because at that moment, then all the wrong you're doing is actually in your mind is something that is good. It's something that's helpful to culture and society as a whole. And if the devil can confuse you about what is good, he wins, because then everything, because we're designed to do what is good. That's how we're designed. So then we have to think through, what is it that Gen Z does not know, so that we can tell them what is true and help them. This is what's going to help them. And so it is good for us to think through, how do they process information? It's good for us to think through all the things that you've done. But I think one piece that is very important for leaders of Gen Z, whether that be a parent, a pastor, a Christian school teacher, is to think through, what are some things that they're deceived about? And I would say that these are things culture at large is deceived about, but certainly something that is shaping their worldview. So we just had a banquet and we updated our logo. And so just as a fun icebreaker, this was for our ministry. As a fun icebreaker, I put the logo in a jigsaw puzzle and a 6-piece puzzle. And we had everybody at each table pick a person who was blindfolded to put the puzzle together while everyone else at the table is telling them how to put it together. So here we are, the Center for Truth and Love having a banquet, and we're tearing apart marriages, and it's, it was really fun. But what happened is people had to tell the person who's blindfolded how to put the pieces of the puzzle together because they could not see. And untruth is like blindness, and truth is like light. And so we did this as an illustration, as a fun game, but also as an illustration to say, you cannot put the pieces of the puzzle of your life together if you cannot see what is true. And so if we really want to help Gen Z, we have to help them put the pieces of the puzzle together. And so then that then begs the question, well, what is it that Gen Z doesn't know? What don't they know? Because if I can identify what they don't know, I can take the Bible and show you, here's what you need to know. And so I always frame this conversation, if I have limited time, in terms of deficits. What do they not know? Because when I can identify what they don't know, then I can help them. And so that's the frame for the conversation. What are 7 things that Gen Z does not know? And there's a progression. Before I get to that, let me just pause for a second and take a breath. Does that at least make sense to you, Josh? Is that progression?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the tensions that Anna talked about and Senator Crane talked about, or other presenters, was a tension in between kind of understanding the generation and then challenging them. And
right.
I know from your heart, yes, certainly we want to love them. We want to walk alongside them, have a relationship, but are we truly loving if we don't help them see clearly? And so, yes, it makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so let's break that down. What are 7 things that Gen Z does not know? And so number 1 is they don't know who they are. This is what I talked about a little earlier. By looking at journal articles in the 1990s and early 2000s, I made the prediction that one of the greatest challenges, if not the greatest challenge Gen Z would face, is human identity. And one of those articles was written by Chris Ingraham. It was called Heterosexuality, It's Just Not Natural. And she ends the article by saying, rendering one form of sociosexual relations as dominant by constructing it as natural is both contradictory and violent. In other words, the heterosexuality we learned to think of as natural is anything but, period, end of article. And this was an entire book based on a compilation of journal articles written from 1998 to 2000, based on journal articles written, an article written in 1988 by Weston Zimmerman called Doing Gender, which was also based on research from Foucault, from some of the French cultural revolution in the 1960s, which was based on Nazi phenomenology in the 1930s. So it took a long time for us to go, almost 100 years for us to kind of embrace, or about 80 years for us to embrace these ideas in America. But they were being written out early on. And so I believe what we're seeing now is a total confusion of humanness. Now, here's why this is so important. If I cannot look at my body parts, my biology, to identify who I am, and that's what Doing Gender 1988, that was the whole concept. We used to look at gender as biology. Now it is the way you behave in the world. That's how you determine who you are. So you may be biologically a man, but the way I determine my masculinity or femininity or whatever I am is based on how I behave, not who I am. Well, at the moment that you deceive a generation about their human identity, what epistemology or way of thinking do they have to determine anything else? So if I can't look at my body parts and go, oh, I'm a man. No, that's not how you determine it. Well, then how do I determine anything else? Because I walk outside and I go, I know it's raining because drops of water are falling from the sky. You say, oh, no, that's not how we determine rain. Rain is some other thing. Well, if we cannot look at the real world to determine reality, then I have lost all ability to understand any truth whatsoever. And so that takes us to the next step with, if I don't know who I am, then I don't know how to find the truth. And if I don't know how to find the truth, then I don't know how to have a quality perspective of what love is. And that's what we've seen. We've seen a cultural definition of love. So love now becomes complete acceptance of anything because I don't have a truthful way to define love. That can mean anything. So I don't know who I am. I don't know how to find the truth. I don't know how to love. And if I don't know how to love correctly, I don't know how to make proper moral assessments. All of us would agree that that stopping someone who's addicted to drugs, like someone who's drug addicted, should not live their truth, which is like, I love drugs. No, we want to step into that story and say, this is wrong. But if I don't have a good definition of what is true, then I don't have a good definition of what is loving. So then I can't make moral assessments and go, hey, let me step into your story and say this is wrong. Well, if I don't know how to discern things that are morally, then I don't know how to have a proper disagreement in culture. And so we see this all the time with safe spaces on college campuses. They don't know how to disagree. And because they don't know how to disagree, they don't know how to handle failure. So the moment someone comes up and says, well, actually, you've done A, B, or C wrong, you've failed. Well, I don't know how to handle that. So Gen Z has become a generation of suicide. And then ultimately, this is a generation that doesn't understand how to live by any external creed. One thing that Christians and Muslims have in common is that they have a book that we say is authoritative. A true Christian says the Bible is what guides my worldview. A true Muslim is someone that says the Quran guides my worldview. But this is a generation that says me guides my worldview. And I apologize for the grammar, but the truth of it is very true. I'm my own Bible. I don't understand conceptually someone going like, oh, there's a book out there that you would tell me how to live my life. And so if you want to look at 7 deficits, Gen Z does not know who they are. And because they don't know who they are, they don't know how to find the truth. They don't have a good definition of love. They don't know how to make moral assessments or to discern. They don't know how to disagree. They don't know how to fail. And they don't know how to live by an external creed. And when you put those pieces together, all of a sudden, when you look at Gen Z, you go, oh, I know how to evangelize them now. I know how to speak to them now because I know where these deficits are. And literally, Josh, there's a camp I speak at in Tennessee every single summer, and the same churches come back. And so after a while, you start running out of your cool camp stories and all your illustrations and your favorite messages. And so this past summer, I spoke at camp and I just went through those 7 things. And I said, okay, if these things are true, I tell leaders all the time that they're true. Well, I'm going to preach to these deficits. Hey, teenagers, you don't know who you are. And then you don't know how to find what is true. I'm telling you, when I started just going, okay, what is the Bible? Forget all the stories and the fun stuff. What does the Bible say about these issues? These kids are on the edge of their seat going, oh, this is what I want to know. My life is a total disaster because I can't put the pieces together. But you just took the blindfold off by speaking to these deficits. So I'm sorry I'm going on and on, but I hope that, I just kind of gave an overview there. Obviously, if we had more time, we could break each one of those down, but hopefully that's helpful at least.
Absolutely. So I wanted to make sure I have these correctly. So don't know who they are, don't know how to find the truth, don't know the definition of love, don't know how to make a moral assessment, don't know how to disagree, don't know how to fail, and don't know how to live by an external creed. Did I get those correct?
Man, that is impressive. Wow.
Well,
somebody was listening. That's awesome. Those are the exact 7.
Okay. So I wanted to, there's one issue that's kind of bound up in this, and then I wanted to come back to the 7, but I'm sure those that are listening are familiar with the fact versus feeling issue. I heard someone recently talk about a well-known Norwegian philosopher queen named Queen Elsa, who says, no right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free. And so it's kind of all about, oh, this is how I feel, therefore it's true. And so that difference between fact and feeling, would you talk a little bit about how that has affected Gen Z, and then kind of how do we effectively respond to that? Because if someone's in the middle of feeling something and then you just come in with a fact, I do think Christ cared about people's feelings in a sense, but he also spoke the truth to them. So how do we deal with that issue?
Oh, my goal is just to tell you what's wrong. Bring someone else in to figure out how to fix it. Okay. I will say that is a lot of, you mentioned Stone Street earlier, and I was speaking at a conference with him, and it was so funny because he got done in the Q&A, and basically that was the question. Okay, well, here's all the problems. How do we fix it? And it was really funny. It was like, well, a lot of us just find what the problem is, and we may, it's for someone else to figure out. And so, but here's what I would say. Okay, and I'm very passionate about trying to figure out ways to fix these things. So first of all, you go fact versus feeling. Well, once again, it helps us to understand where the problem comes from. So I just had to replace. We just redid. I had a house that had a flood in it, so we did all the drywall from 4 feet down. Well, then we got back and put all the cabinets up against the wall, and now they're all black again. And we're like, what happened? And like, we just fixed this. Well, it's because there was another leak in the house. Oh, no. So you've got to find where the problems are before you can really get to where you need to go. So there's value in that. So here's what I would say: fact versus feeling. Well, where's that coming from? Why would someone who used to go, like, we had a culture that used to have facts, where's the feeling come from? And it comes from an epistemology that says you determine who you are by how you feel about who you are. That's how you come to truth. That is why gender identity is so foundational and so problematic. We have decided as a culture that you don't look at your anatomy or biology to determine who you are. You determine that by how you feel. So then if that's how I determine my identity, that's how I look at the entire world. So the way to combat fact versus feeling is to go back to the source and go, that's not a good way to come to truth. Feeling is not a proper epistemology. Epistemology is the way you come to truth. And so you have to address these things from an epistemological standpoint. And let me illustrate how maybe an illustration will be better than just talking about it. So I'm debating the godless engineer. And so on Twitter, he comes at me with, your God is so evil. How could he, determine all the deaths of these people? God is evil. So now what I could do is come back and go, well, actually, your understanding of complete annihilation in the Old Testament, I could give him all these facts. But rather than do that, what I did was I challenged his epistemology. I said, okay, God's evil. How do you, if I conceded that momentarily, how do you come to the conclusion that anything is evil if there is no absolute standard of right and wrong? How do you come to that? Explain that to me. And so I challenged his epistemology, and the reality is even if God is evil, it doesn't mean he doesn't exist. You're using the fact that God is evil as some evidence that he does not exist, when the reality is the fact that you understand evil demonstrates that there has to be a moral lawgiver. And so I would say, when you come to fact versus feeling, somebody says, well, I feel this way about a thing. And what that demonstrates to me is that you believe that truth does exist. You just arrive at it at feelings. And so I'd want to take the specific thing, the specific issue, and kind of more challenge the epistemology. And what I mean by that is the way that they came to that conclusion. And just in terms of philosophy, really fast. So semantics is the words that we use. Epistemology is the way that we come to truth. And ontology is the actual idea that we're discussing. So if someone says to me, well, I just don't feel like that is right. Well, what I would say is, okay, well, should your feelings then determine what is true? Because if that's the case, then what I would say is, well, I feel like you're wrong. So what do you say to that? So it's just a way. I think what we have to do is understand that if we're going to get anywhere with somebody, don't come up with facts. Come at them, help them understand how to think correctly. Because once I teach someone how to think correctly, then I can introduce facts. And I think that is the key. And I think that's the reality is we can't avoid facts. We can't go, well, this is just a feelings-based culture, so we can't come at people with facts. We must come at people with facts because that's how we come to truth. So then in a feelings-based culture, you have to teach them, first of all, that feelings are not the correct guide to truth and to demonstrate that. I hope that's helpful. I'm sorry, in a podcast, it's tough to tackle some of these issues.
No, and it's very consistent with some things we've talked about to date. Whereas if you have a member of Gen Z that comes to you and throws this, maybe they've been in a Christian school their whole life, but throws a very non-Christian school question at you, like, well, does God really exist? Or what about same-sex attraction? Or why does God hate gay people? Some of these questions that would get thrown at us. It's easy for church leaders to almost immediately respond with, "That's not true. You can't believe that here." That'll shut them down. They'll go ask the question somewhere else.
Right.
But we've lost our opportunity to have a dialogue. And so this fits right in there to be able to ask them, well, why do you think that? I love that response to the godless engineer. Another example that came up in the course of the podcast was a question about abortion. And Anna was able to use the story of Frankenstein to get that student to actually think, and actually the student figured it out for himself as he was walking through that. So specifically to the fact versus feeling issue, is it questions about, well, what happens if your heart tells you two different things? Help me to understand, what is that feeling really about? And then a recent question that I've heard a good bit is, so, the godless engineer says, God's evil. Well, tell me a little bit more about this God that you hate, or this God that you don't believe in. Maybe I don't actually believe in that God either, because you're not describing the God of the Bible. So I think that is helpful. Trying to, maybe not at times answering the question head on, but trying to get the root of how they think about it and how they came to that conclusion. And I found that because modern ideologies are so pervasive, you probably aren't getting an original idea being thrown at you. So there's a kind of a common set of questions we should be prepared to answer. So any other thoughts on the fact versus feeling issue?
Yeah, I would circle back to two things. There's just some practical ways that you can do exactly what you just described, Josh. And I probably came at it a more esoteric way. Josh, you broke it down so clearly. But two things I would say is, one is the question, what do you mean by that, cuts through the semantics. And that gets the conversation starting. So when someone says, well, I mean, like, how, whatever they're saying, you disagree, rather than just going like, well, let me tell you what's true. Ask them what they mean by that. And that cuts through semantics. And then the next question that cuts through the epistemology is, how did you come to that conclusion? Okay. And those are two powerful questions that you can ask without ever giving anything that's true. And here's the thing about untruth is it tends to disprove itself if you spend enough time thinking truthfully about it. And one of the best examples of that is Rachel Dolezal and Bruce Jenner or Caitlyn Jenner. So at the same time, Caitlyn Jenner is getting an award from ESPN for being a man that transitioned into a woman, which is not biologically possible. Rachel Dolezal is a Caucasian or white woman pretending to be Black or African American. And she is denigrated in culture for being, oh, you're white, but you're pretending that you're identifying as Black. Well, how is it wrong for Rachel Dolezal to identify as Black if she's white, if it's right for Bruce Jenner or Caitlyn Jenner to identify as a woman if he's biologically a man? So some of these ideas almost upend themselves if you look at the whole picture. And we see that all the time in culture. In fact, one of the cultural commentators that if you look at 90% of his tweets, is Charlie Kirk, who basically just over and over again goes, well, if this is true, then how can this be true? And it really is about, that's not a flat out endorsement of Charlie Kirk, but the point is he does a great job of going, well, if this is true, think about this. And he does that often politically, but those things are true, scripturally through the world, is that God has woven his truth into all kinds of things. And if one thing is true, then another thing is. So what do you mean by that? And then how did you come to that conclusion rather than just throwing facts at someone?
And I will note that those questions are hard to ask on social media or outside the context of some form of relationship. And so I think it does press us to, are you actually in relationship with someone, or even, someone like the Godless Engineer being willing to have a public conversation, but you probably don't get there unless you've taken that or made that effort. One of the follow-ups I had on these 7 that you mentioned. So if one of the chief deficits, one of the chief issues Gen Z faces is human identity. Who am I? And it makes a lot of sense. If you don't have a strong foundation, there, as you try to build something, it just begins to sway and nothing is solid. It actually reminds me of, I think, Francis Schaeffer's quote that, modern man has his feet planted squarely in midair, or it's something along those lines. How then, maybe preaching at a camp or talking to someone individually, how do you help them have a foundation that says, here's who I am as a human? How do you speak to that issue as a point of evangelism?
Well, you declare what is true. And I think at one point, I think you establish a proper epistemology. Hey, we don't determine what is true by how I feel. And oftentimes when I talk about that at a camp, I kindly make fun of the foolishness, follow your heart. And I kindly make fun of it. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? And I'll stick my chest out and like walk around the stage like I'm literally following my heart. And kids laugh. And it's like, okay, well, I'm not, it's a little physical comedy, but at the same time, I'm like, okay, so that's not what we mean. What do we mean? We say follow your emotions. And I'm like, how many of you have felt 2 different emotions in the same day? I always give an illustration. When I wake up early in the morning for a flight, I don't feel like being nice to people. Should I follow that truth? Should I just be no, I don't feel good. I'm not excited about the day. Should I just, so we understand intuitively that you don't follow your emotions. And then once I establish that, then I go, well, we have to look at what is true. And what is true is that we need someone who is God to tell us what is true. So let's look at his word. And I did this summer, and it was powerful. So I talked about camp. This summer, I started the first night is I just talked about what was true about humanness. And it is sad that and I just want people watching, understand, whether you believe me or not, that it is the primary issue. I'm telling you, if you speak to a group of 100 kids, 20 to 30 of them are struggling with who they are, maybe 50 to 60. But you can't speak to a group of 10 kids where 2 or 3 are not going like, I'm not sure about my human identity. I know some of you may be listening to this right now and not believe me. You don't have to. I'm telling you, that's true. There is a massive number of kids confused about who they are. So I did exactly that. I talked about epistemology, how we come to truth. Then I said, I just want you to know it's not true that boys can be girls and girls can be boys. That's just not true. And I said, here's why. And I showed them from the Bible how God created 2 kinds of people. And I showed them also from the Bible how everything God had made was good up until he gets to Adam. And he goes, it's not good that man should be alone. And there's a repetition in the Hebrew there where it's poetic. He goes, and everything that God made was good. And behold, it was good. And it was good. And it was good. And then all of a sudden you get to Adam and he goes, it's not good that man should be alone. That's why God made 2 kinds of people. I'm like, there's not 6 races or 10 races, but there's only 2 kinds of people biblically. And those are men and women. And then based on that truth, we just have to make a decision. Are we going to go with God's design, or are we going to go with an invented design? And then I would say, but we're all confused. You may be confused about your gender, but all of us are confused about something because of sin. And then I go from that to, well, God has a solution for sin. And then I just gave the gospel. And I want to tell you what happened. So at the end of that, the gospel had been preached Tuesday night, the night before. They had a big invitation. I think they had 30, 40 kids get saved. And I just gave the gospel again. And I just said, if you would like to repent of your sins and trust on Jesus and be saved, because you may be confused about truth, would you just stand right where you're at? Well, I mean, this is camp. There's 500 kids in the room. Josh, we had 11 kids stand to their feet right then. One of them was a 14-year-old girl who was sitting on the second row. She stands right up. And when she stood, I was like, this girl wants to be sitting. You could see it all over her face. Wow. So I just said, hey, we're going to have the piano come and play. Why don't you just walk to the back? There's counselors back there that can help you. So all these kids walk to the back. Same girl. She comes to me about 30 minutes later, the joy of Jesus on her face. And she goes, amen. I got saved. She gives a testimony at the end of the week, Josh, and she says, I was confused about whether I was a boy or a girl. 14-year-old girl. I didn't know who I was. And she said, God saved me this week. And then 2 weeks later, or 2 months later, I get a text video from her youth pastor. And it's this young lady sitting in a baptismal tank and identifying with Christ. I'm telling you, the biggest struggle that many of these kids have is who they are. And if you can show them biblically who they are, the other pieces fall into place. And identity is so huge. And here this girl had heard a full gospel presentation the night before, but heard the gospel in the context of human identity and received Christ. And it's just neat how the Spirit works. But if anyone's listening here, if you walk away with anything, a deficit, I'm telling you, kids are struggling with identity far more than you may realize. And then they're struggling, if not identity, they're struggling with a quality epistemology to come to truth. So when we give propositional truth from Scripture, the devil's like, great, I already got a firewall up. These kids don't accept propositional truth. So you've got to teach them how to accept propositional truth and then give them propositional truth. And I'm sorry, I just wanted to share that story. I'm going way too long, Josh. I'm sorry. I just get excited about this stuff. So
that's such a beautiful story. And just a few follow-ups. It's amazing. I think a lot of pastors might be a little reluctant. Okay, I'm going to speak about gender identity at a camp, or I'm going to speak at gender identity at a church service. Like that's going to be kind of my tough topic conversation. You put it in the salvation message,
yes,
which just strikes me as a complete flip. But just to kind of pile on the bandwagon, as far as this is a key issue, not research, but conversations I've had within the last week or two of man whose wife teaches in Texas, and just learned about a school district here in Indiana where teachers are having a large portion, not anywhere close to half, but a large percentage of their classes. And this is not the liberal East Coast, the liberal West Coast. I mean, this is the heartland of America, where a good percentage of these classes are kids wrestling with, am I a boy, am I a girl? And we call it the social contagion. Some of the stats out of England, because we don't really have many stats here in the United States, is that it exploded something like 5,000% from 2007 to 17 at the primary gender clinic in England. So to say, absolutely, I mean, I see this as a huge issue, but just beautiful to see that particular story about that girl coming to Christ. Any other examples recently? And it'd be hard to top that one. That's amazing. But any other examples?
Well, I can give you some to the level of this. Well, you don't have to believe me because I'm used to that. I mean, for over a decade, I've been saying the greatest problem with Gen Z to people who don't even know who Gen Z is gender identity. And like, I'm telling you, most people just like, I don't believe you. But you saw a 5,000% growth from 2007 to 2017. But another example, so Santa Rosa County, which is actually where I just moved, so I live in Santa Rosa County. When Trump was president, you couldn't call that more Trump country than anywhere else. In fact, the first big rally that he ever had, like the very first one, was 60 miles away from Santa Rosa County. Sunday school class in my church, talking with a teacher in Santa Rosa County, 5th grade class. So this is a 5th grade teacher. She has 4 girls in her class that identify as boys.
Wow.
I'm like, wait, what does she have? I didn't ask the class of 25. So 20% of her class in the 5th grade identifies as opposite gender. And those are ones that identify. How many are struggling that just don't really know?
And there's much to think about, much to be concerned about, much to pray about as we look towards the future. But for today's to bring today's conversation to a close, we've talked about how can we engage Gen Z. There's certainly a lot on the horizon. I think we have to be responsible for what we do in our own zip code, our own families, our own schools. So how can we most effectively engage Gen Z? I love this idea of focusing in on humanness as kind of this foundational issue to work on the issue of evangelism. Do you have anything else kind of to add as a summary statement on how we can best engage Gen Z in changing times?
God has given us his word and his Holy Spirit. And I have wrestled with this for years because I've been predicting what I call a sociological apocalypse. I mean, like I've even committed scripture verses to memory so I can have them in prison. Like, I'm prepared. I know that sounds incredibly negative, but the church, so I would say 3 things. One is the gates of hell will not prevail against us, that we have the victory. But there have been moments in time where God has not brought revival, but there have been a remnant that, and the church has always considered it a privilege to suffer for the king. It's always been considered a privilege. And so I think we have to step away from our American view and go, I just want everything to be wonderful. And go, you know what? I may not be popular, but as much as I can, God has given us his word and he's given us his Holy Spirit. And while I can, I want to raise up a remnant to pass that on. And one of our board members says this. He goes, I love being part of Center for Truth and Love because I think that God is going to use this ministry. And I feel the exact way about the Good Citizen podcast and the Good Citizen organization, is that I think God is using the Good Citizen and the Center for Truth and Love and other ministries to preserve his gospel in this time. And maybe he'll come back, but maybe he won't for several hundred years. And Josh, you and I get to have that opportunity where we get to be a part of that. And that would be every Christian, every faithful parent, every faithful pastor right now might be one of those people that God uses to preserve his word in this. Like, we get to be a part of this. And what an opportunity. And so, I mean, we could look at it negatively, but man, to get to heaven and God says, I selected you to be a vessel. It's my work. It's his work. but man, we get to be a vessel. And so I'm excited that we get to be vessels of this. So I look at, I mean, like, I think the reality is that there's negative things, but the positive is that there's, what an opportunity. So I've gone on and on today. I would say this: if you want to follow us at the Center for Truth and Love, just go there, the centerfortruthandlove.org. And if you would like a free resource, you could just text in 33777, Trinity, completion, 33777. Text the word prepared to that number, prepared, and we'll send you a free ebook on how to speak the truth in love as well. So.
And Ben, I appreciate your heart, and that is a moment where you kind of shift from woe is me to, wow, God's placed me here in this moment, this critical moment for the American church, I think for the American experiment, and I get to serve him in these times. That certainly can help shift our outlook from despair to, this is a noble thing. I get to serve God and build his kingdom now. So, well, we appreciate your thoughts. Continue to be praying for your ministry. Look forward to seeing what God's going to do in 2022.
So honored to be with you, Josh.